So my name is Lisa Weinstein, and I'm here with Deb Gowen, and as you know, I would love a chance to interview you for the American College of Nurse Midwives Legacy Project. Excited to be with you today, and that you've agreed to share with us your story. This project, as you know, is important because it, one, allows me to, as a student midwife, to get to know more of your story and your journey and your pearls, but also provide you with an opportunity to share with the whole community about your life and your journey. So thank you for allowing us to participate in this.
Thank you.
And so just to get started, I would love to know a little bit more about what drew you to midwifery in the first place, if there were people or events in your life, in your past that instigated your entry.
So I think that my path was common for my time frame in one way, which is we came into it, many of us during that time, from a political feminist standpoint. And that was common to most of the midwives I was meeting at that time. Mine is different in that I didn't know what a midwife was, so I wasn't someone who always wanted to be a nurse or a midwife or in the healing professions or in the healthcare professions. In fact, I was an English major in my first degree, so my friends would have known me more as the writer or the poet. That's what I wanted to do. And yet I got out of school and was a photographer for a while, and then I was a retail manager of health food stores, and so I became interested in holistic healing, health, alternatives. Didn't feel as if that was big enough, broad enough for what I wanted to do, and spent a lot of time in that new hippie state of mind asking the universe for an answer. So how I came to midwifery was that literally I had a dream with the word midwife in the air. I woke from the dream and there was a word midwife, and I asked my partner, what do you think that's like doing births at home? And that's how I backed into midwifery. I then had to investigate the types of midwifery and found out that there were home-based midwives who did apprentice style. There were nurse midwives, which meant at that point I would have to go back to school to become a nurse first. Big daunting thing. But it incorporated health, it incorporated supporting women in a feminist perspective and choice and listening to people and being with them, and it provided a forum for me to be able to learn and educate, which one of my jobs before I was a midwife was substitute teacher for a year, so I did enjoy that aspect. And the decision was made for me. I actually looked into OB/GYN to go to med school as well, but I definitely knew I didn't want to deal with pathology as a base. I didn't want to do surgery or interventive measures like that. I really wanted to do the teaching holistic angle. So from there I looked into nurse midwifery versus home birth and decided that from my personal perspective, healthcare institutions and hospitals were very frightening places. So that if I were going to support women, I wanted the credentials to be able to go into the places that were difficult for them. So I was living in Cambridgeport at the time. It was spring. BU was the closest nursing school. I went over and applied in August, and they let me start in September. And that's how I got to be a midwife.
Can you tell us about your educational experience, and if there were any professors or preceptors that
Sure.
had an impact?
Sure. My nursing experience started out great. They had a pacing program, which meant that I could work full-time and still go to nursing school and try to get the nursing degree. We didn't have the 3-year programs in place in the same way that we do now, where someone can go in and become a nurse on the way to midwifery. So I actually had to do the full nursing program. During that education, I found the instructors to be authoritarian and everything that I hated about what I perceived to be the nursing world. I came from the perspective of politicism, where nurses were handmaidens, and not from the place of respect that I now, of course, hold for them. But then I had preconceived notions. I had one particular instructor that was, that I had a power struggle with, and I lost a whole year of nursing school because of her. And what she told me behind closed doors was she had the authority to do anything to me, and that I had to behave. And I erroneously said something like, but I could be your peer, like in 2 years, or your administrator in 4, like we should be colleagues. I was, again, a returning student at 27. That was difficult. Midwifery school was wonderful. I went to Columbia, and my small department was lovely. They treated us all as peers from the beginning. They educated as I thought educators should. I can name some names because I remember them fondly. Barbara Decker was the director of the program at the time, and Patty Akins-Murphy was one of my instructors, and she's still active. She was, even back then, in 1985, she was into publishing for midwives. She really felt that that was the way to establish the profession. And then, who else was there? Oh, Ronnie Lickstein, who went on to write a GYN book that I valued with Heather, whose last name is escaping me. So they were good instructors, they were great role models. My education at Columbia was fabulous. Let's see, and out of school, one of my preceptors, Valerie Houdinius, was a long-time, well-respected midwife in this area, who also graduated from Columbia, so she took me on as an integration student here in the area. I was pregnant at the time. She was at my birth. She was my preceptor. She taught me a lot about trusting birth. The doc she worked with Mitch Levine, just recently retired his private practice women care. They were fabulous. As a new midwife, they were fabulous. I went from integration to taking a break to be with the baby, and then started working with them as my first job. And it was a great experience. I owe a lot to them. They believed in women. Dr. Levine believed that birth should be attended by midwives and not obstetricians, except for emergencies or C-sections. So every person who entered our practice was told they could not see him as a provider, only midwives. And he backed us up for the emergencies, so it was fabulous practice. Yeah, it was, yes.
So as you grew into a
Seasoned.
experienced or seasoned midwife, right? Did you have any, special moments or challenges that impacted you, or any sign of the times that, or in the political world that you think had a major influence on how you practiced? Or
There's so much. So every generation is going to have their issues. From my generation, we were working with women reclaiming birth, and they had to reclaim birth in many ways. So in my generation, that was the generation that had to, where childbirth education started, because they weren't allowed to come into the hospital and ask for unmedicated birth without proving they were up to it, and that meant taking classes to get them prepared. Prior to that, we had 20 years of forced medication for women, spinals, forceps. But we know that way back, the legacy of women giving birth was that they were competent and they could be unmedicated. So I had childbirth education women. I had people coming in who were demanding not to be shaved because shaving was the normal option. They were demanding not to be given IVs, even though most hospitals were counter-demanding IV access. They were demanding eating and drinking. This was a whole culture of give us back our rights, give us back our legacy. So that shaped a lot. My whole world in the beginning of midwifery was spent dealing with hostile environments for women, for the most part, with physicians who didn't trust or respect midwives, except for the doctors I personally worked with. But in general, there was a suspicion. In general, nurses also didn't trust midwives, and consumers weren't sure what we were, except for the few educated ones seeking us out. So that shaped a lot of what I was doing. was explaining all the time to everyone about who we were and what we were. And that was tiring. That was tiring.
It sounds incredibly challenging for at any point in our lifetime to be in a midwifery career. What sustained you because it is so challenging all the time?
I had a vision when I started of what I wanted to do. I felt called to it, in that proverbial calling of a dream, for instance, so I knew it was right for me. I was getting a lot from it. I liked being steady for people. I liked turning into the person they could trust. I liked earning it. I'm particularly qualified for it. I don't mind stepping up and speaking truths, and I don't get mad at people. I don't get mad at a physician who doesn't trust me in the way that some people do. I think it's an educational issue. So I stayed in it because there was a place for us. There was a place for me. Every time I went to work, I knew I was in the right spot doing the right thing. When I was active in midwifery all these years, I often said that I got as much from the career as the people I served got. And I truly believe that. I think I got as much as they did. I learned some skills to be with them, but then they allowed me to be with them, and that's a gift. Being allowed to be there and letting someone trust you is a big gift. We don't always notice it. When our children trust us, it's a gift, you know, that some of us take for granted. But it's real, and so is the gift of having someone trust you in a transformational time. I liked being with women in transformation.
Can you speak more to that? Because I've learned from some articles that you've helped me be privy to about your philosophy about being with women.
I think it's a midwifery philosophy that that this is a time that's a rite of passage for women. Men often had rites of passage which included going to war. Has been hopefully diminished with each generation, and women had giving birth. There were not many rituals. Maybe they both had marriage and death. So we took that away from women. We took away their ability to transform by taking away their right to birth. It's critical. Transformation, the right to be transformed is critical. And when we take away that, we take away the pain or the magic or the wonder of life, we are diminishing ourselves as humans, in my opinion. So I do think they can transform in their labor and birth, and in fact, I tell women, so our practice, I think my early practice, attracted women who were very intelligent and did their research, but we also attracted injured and hurt women. We were known to be a practice where they could come if they had a history of abuse, where they had a history of abuse, either physical, sexual, alcoholic, absent parents, whether they had trauma from a mugging, whether they were disconnected from their bodies in some way. We were safe. We were safe for gynecologic care, but we were also safe for obstetrics. So that gave me a window that I might not have had. And what I learned was if we leave women alone to reconnect with their bodies, it's a healing that lasts them a lifetime. So when I meet women in prenatal care, I might say that. I might say that they have an opportunity in 9 months to do 5 years of therapy. And that's because not just their intellect, but their heart is now open. So too are their body memories. We suppress our emotional traumas, even our intellectual ones, but our emotional ones for sure, and even our spirit, when our spirit is crushed as children, we put that into our body. We put it into our body by raising our shoulders before we get hit. We put it into our body by shrugging when somebody tells us something that hurts us, with striding, with holding ourselves. Eventually that leads to physical pain later, but in the meantime, we hold our stories there. When our bodies are changing, when women's bodies are changing in pregnancy, and they're changing, they are actually opening and allowing tissue that hasn't moved to move, which then gives them an opportunity to remember. And when they can remember, they can then be available to themselves to learn. So, it doesn't have to be just the birth experience, and this is where women go wrong. They think that the birth experience, and I don't mean go wrong in a bad way, but it's in the taught way. They think the birth experience is what will transform them, and it's not. It is the emotional and physical access during the entire pregnancy, as well as the birth and the unforgettable postpartum period. So if they're able to be open to it, they will start accessing things that will help them. And then during the birth, I'll just add one little story about that, that I learned early on, which is adult children of alcoholics. This is parlor psych. We're going to just cut it down to small little chop here. They often are taught that they're never good enough. So what do we get in the literature? We see the type A's who have alcoholic parents who succeed to the max, because they're not going to be able to be criticized if they can do everything perfectly. You get very driven, perfect people. But there are the other ones who never quite finish anything because they've been told it's not going to be good enough, it's not going to be right. Those women often stall in labor just when they're 9 centimeters. They're having a beautiful labor, they're in the flow of their bodies, and they stall. Why? Because if they were to finish, they would be countermanding everything they've been taught about how successful they can be. So they stop. If we don't intervene and we allow as much time as necessary, their bodies have to finish. They will reconnect, they will get brave, and they will have a baby. If we interfere and we add Pitocin because we need to get the labor going, we are actually, in my opinion, and it is political and maybe leftist, we are robbing them of an opportunity to heal. They don't know that, but I feel that I learned that early, and it's really real. Similarly with women who don't push for long periods of time. Those women who have physical abuse, they'll get to fully dilated. They won't stop at 9 like the adult child. They'll get to fully. When they get to fully dilated, the baby will sit in the vaginal birth canal for forever. Those women do not want to push. They cannot endure that sensation. Penny Simkin did a great book on this, and God bless her for that. You know, she and I we go back that generation that learned this, and she was gracious enough and thoughtful enough to write a book about this. But allow whatever time it takes. She'll eventually have a baby, and she will have reconnected with that generous and giving and lovely side of her that had been abused.
That's beautiful. I was hoping you would share a story.
Okay.
So, in the reality of the situation,
yes.
when you're asked, you know, when, as you well know, some women feel like they're on a clock, you know, due to hospital policies or whatnot, do you feel like you've had the space to allow women to?
I used to answer that and jump right in. I used to have the space. I had some lovely community hospitals early in my career, and the nurses were behind it. They saw that disaster didn't strike with time. That disaster strikes sometimes in very short time spans. It's not about a protracted labor where disaster strikes. So those nurses were supportive, and they allowed, and yes, it's sometimes agonizingly slow, but we had plenty of time, or I wouldn't have learned these lessons. Those of us who got these lessons got them because we were allowed to observe birth and labor as it progresses, which some of the midwives who don't attend births in hospitals get to do. In hospitals, we have the reality of the medical model. We have the reality of healthcare systems and reimbursement and time and rooms and resources, and we intervene. The best you can do in those cases, because you're still there to serve your women, and this is what we have, is to know this, is to maybe do your work prenatally with them to try to get to their source of discomfort. That's where talking about therapy and in whatever fashion and looking for support early is, so that birth doesn't become that pivotal point where they feel sabotaged or pushed. And I think things are changing enough that we're affording more time. The Friedman curve is going to change a little bit. So, yay!
Yes,
yes, you know.
Yeah.
No, it'll change more.
Yeah.
So we'll allow women to be women again, and not something else that we need them to be in order to have a smoothly running unit.
So it seems like you've presented a lot about your role as a counselor and as a healer, and influenced by a lot of, you know, your world that you're living in. Can you speak a little bit to your, you know, anything that you feel that you haven't mentioned that has had an impact on how you practice, or any other stories that have kind of been...
Are you thinking about my birth story? Is that what you're thinking of?
That'd be great.
So, I shared with Lisa my birth story, and I think it's valuable, but it's a story, and I want people to understand it's just a story. We all have them. Our stories shape us, but they're not who we are, and that's really important. I think we don't differentiate the difference between what we've lived and who we really are. My birth story is here for the world to see. My mom was in a separation situation with my dad, and she, for all her own reasons, which she and I were totally close at the end, she sold me when I was born in 1952 for the sum of $2,000. It was good money then. She had, I have older step-sibling sister, and that was the only girl my mom kept. So she sold me. She was pregnant with another daughter before me, and she had her at the home of a childless couple and was a surrogate for them and gave that daughter up. And so she only raised her oldest daughter. The other two of us were discarded. I saw my siblings growing up. I saw my dad's side of the family. He went on to have 4 kids with a second wife. My mom had another kid with him before they really gave it up. And I was raised by my grandmother. My father was fairly wealthy a lot of his life. My mother was a hardworking woman. And I was raised with my grandmother, my father's mother, on welfare, in poverty, clinic situations for health care, where you never felt respect and you never felt listened to. And that's why I say they were scary places. So that's my birth story. So in the mythological literature, healers are always wounded healers who go on to create their healing by helping others. And I wouldn't deny that that's a piece of this. I think that's a piece of a lot of people's initiative to move into some place. This was deep in me though, so as I said, it had to come through a dream. I would never have connected with wanting to move forward and heal my own patterns by helping women. But initially when I went into midwifery, I had an eye to going into the inner city populations, the poverty populations, the abandoned women populations, the single mom populations, the places that I grew up in where there was no respect or help. And if I could help with those transitions, I thought it might help create healthier, stable families. That was way before I became, before I graduated. Once I graduated, I realized all women needed care. It didn't matter double master's degree families, or it didn't matter. This was an illusion I had that inner city women were really more in desperate need. But all women are in need of respect, education, and collaboration. We really need to follow the midwife means with women, and in our case, you know that, it means listen to women. Every time, just listen. If you listen, she tells you every single thing you need to know to take care of her. You never have to pull it out of your hat. So there's my birth story. Is that what you were thinking about?
It was.
What impacted my yeah, okay. And I don't think anything else really impacted there. I have to think about it for a minute. No.
Well, you just mentioned something, new to this conversation, which was that you had a passion, and you still do, to have the greatest impact on future families. And it seems to draw a lot of people to the profession, or at least keep people there. What else kept you inspired as you went through your years of challenge? And
yeah. So I'm going to reverse the question a little bit and say, what made me want to leave were the hours and hours and hours that we were expected to devote to the profession at the expense of our own families. So that's what I didn't expect. I didn't expect that as a midwife going out to help others, that I would be asked to give up so much of my own. And I think anybody who works or lives with a midwife will relate to this immediately. In my early years, I did 48-hour weekends, every other weekend. At one point, I was on call in the office for 6 weeks straight. It totally impacted my family life. I missed my own family events and milestones to be with others. And that is what drives people out of midwifery, I think, in the old days. They just couldn't sustain that passion. They sadly gave it up. They'd rather be at their own child's graduation than at someone else's birth. We've changed that in the midwifery field a little bit to do 12-hour shifts or 24-hour calls, less call shifts, more humane hours. So that theoretically is going to keep our midwives steady and revived and in the profession because we're being more humane about their lives. That also can be the thing that will not allow midwives to stay in the field, to sustain the passion. In the early days of being long hours with women, I was attached. We got attached. I still see them, many of those women now, I see them for GYN exams and their daughters. So you develop a bond by being with someone in that way that's not time clocked, either for them or for you. That if you're not someone who keeps your perspective, you won't get from the profession what I got from the profession, which is, as I said, an opportunity to be with people in a way that was human and really truthful and sustained. And often in the early days, even when I went off, I would go have breakfast and maybe stop back in to say hi. And sometimes the women couldn't remember which midwife caught the baby because we were both in the room and it was such a seamless transition. And it wasn't just that they saw so many faces they couldn't remember after a 3-day labor. It wasn't, oh, there were so many, I don't actually know. It was that it was such a togetherness that they didn't remember. I think that's what kept me in it, which was I felt we were in a space together, and when you travel experiences with people, you get something from that, and that sustains you. If you try to pull back from that to get a better lifestyle, it's a fine line you walk, and every midwife now just needs to know that. When she leaves at 8 a.m., she leaves at 8 a.m., she may be missing a connection that 1 more hour, lack of sleep, whatever, might have been okay. In an environment where she's expected to leave and not expected to stay, and if she stays, she gets asked questions. She's queried. Why are you still here? Why are you still here? Are you too slow with your paperwork? Or why are you here? I can take care of this. You go home now. The environment has changed, and we shoo our midwives away even if they feel capable or willing to stay because there's too many cooks in the pot, or because we can't afford to pay them, or they might bill us, or that may be that what sustained me also debilitated me is it's going to hold true for your generation.
Yeah. Speaking of, it would be valuable to hear. We've talked a lot actually about pearls or advice to give to the next generation of midwives.
So that would be one, to really give thought to who you are. Each and every person who comes into the field, to give thought to why you really came in. Be honest. If you came in because there's experiences of yours you feel would help people when you share them, or because you want to get healed yourself in some way that you're unconscious about, get conscious. Know why you're there. And then know who you are for stamina or for what you're getting from it. For me, with my background, trust was a big issue. Trust was an issue. So to be able to earn somebody's trust and then to trust the women themselves was very healing for me. I would not deny that. Somebody else might not have a trust issue. She might have the softness of babies. There are a lot of birth junkies in the field. I'm not one of those people, but there are those people. Know what it is that sustains you before you begin, or as you go through it. Another thing would be, and we did talk about this earlier, that my experience throughout the years has been that in diminishing quantities, newer midwives have kind of peaked in at births over the time. When I first started, if it was a new midwife I was working with, well after 1 year out even, or 2 years out, she often would say, "Can I stop in and hang out for this birth?" Because she felt she might regain some energy around birth, or she might learn something, or even in fact learn something negative, like, oh, she does that and I don't want to do that. I wouldn't want to touch a woman like that. I didn't know she touched a woman like that. You want to know that. You want to know how the colleagues in your practice are operating so that you can support them when clients come back. You want to know how they're operating so that you can admire them, so that you can learn from them. And over the years, the newer midwives stopped coming in. They stopped coming in to share births. They didn't ask to be present. They didn't invite me in. But the old timers that I worked with, the people who are my generation, they still, even last year, someone would say, "Hey, I'm just passing through for a meeting. You can have a birth. Can I come in? Would it bother you?" And they would stop in. And it makes for a lot of love in the room. And it's great for even the experienced midwife to get feedback. And I would ask for it. "Hey, what did you think about that the hand movements? Or do you think I should have said da-da-da-da?" You can get experience. I would say never, 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 never stop asking your colleagues if you can hop in and witness, or have someone come in and witness with you.
Yeah.
People are going to lose a lot by not doing
Great.
that. All right.
Is there anything that you're doing now that you have been wanting to do for a long time? What is your plan after retiring? Because you're recently
Retired. Well, I'm recently retired from OB, actually. So what I'm actually doing is, over the years I developed a specialty in bioidentical hormones, perimenopause and menopause, because I listened to the women who came to me, and they came to me with data and information, and they wanted access to these things, and most of the midwives that I knew, even now, weren't doing anything with that. And with research I saw that what's the gem we want to look at? Will I be doing harm? So if a woman asked me and I couldn't see that I would do her harm, I gave it a shot. Now over time it turns out I know a lot about it. So I am still doing that. I still see women for GYN. I'm doing a lot of reading, back to my roots of poetry. And, looking for a new career. Something that, I'm loving sleeping at night, loving it. I'm loving having energy. I'm loving giving my knees a break. So that's what I'll be doing. One of the things we didn't talk about is how physically stressful it is to be a midwife if you actually do labor support. My knees are shot from all the squatting I did, helping and holding women and kneeling by water births and tubs. And many, many nurse midwives get physical injuries and back strain and rotator cuff injuries galore from the physicality of the job. So that's a tough one too, so be careful. And that's all. There's a lot more to do. I have a private healing practice that I stopped doing. I probably won't do that again, but there'll be something else.
So since starting your midwifery career, how has the political landscape evolved?
So it's evolved. That's the good news. In the beginning, I think that the politics was much more obvious, much more divided, and much more about the professions versus the finances. So that's changed. In the beginning we had, as I mentioned, doctors who didn't trust us, wouldn't let us in. We had hospitals who wouldn't let practices in. We had hospitals who closed practices as soon as the census was low for OB, especially if they had residency programs. They would give the births to the residents. We had no job security. Despite the fact that when I started, midwives were named in lawsuits only about 6% of the time, and OBs in their career lives would be named about 70% of the time. So from an institutional viewpoint, you would think that we were desirable. But institutions and OBs would say all the time, and I think this is the same now, not understanding what we do, they would say, "You mean you can't do it in a, fill in the blank, 5, 10, 15-minute, 30-minute visit? Why can't you do it in that time?" because there was a misunderstanding about the approach that was very unique as a midwife. I don't think that's changed as much as I wish it would have. To be squeezed, you're not then doing midwifery. When I started, nurses were much more antagonistic, except for those small hospitals I discussed. Nurses would also be disrespectful and antagonistic, and we spent our time sandwiched between OB and nursing, neither of them wanting to own us, let us in, belong with us, and both of them really not treating us well. I think that's changing. I think, and many of my colleagues would echo this, that depending on the hospital, you'll be aligned with the nurses, and they love you and you love them, or you'll be aligned with the providers, the physician groups, but we're finding a place in our worlds, which we did not find then. We were very stratified. If anything, the nurses took us in, not the doctors. The political landscape changed in a different way, which is when I started and I told someone I was a midwife, they would reply, "So you do home births?" And I would have to explain that no, I actually did births in hospitals. Now at least they know that we exist, that are nurse midwives around, that we can do births in hospitals, so that's changed and lovely. When I started, home birth midwives and nurse midwives tried to collaborate, but it was a very difficult collaboration, and often home birth midwives would say, but they're not real midwives. And 6 years ago I was at a function, social function, and standing next to a midwife who does births at home, who's, direct entry. And someone said, "You're both midwives." And she, without even realizing it was coming out of her mouth, she said, No, we're not. So that's changed, but not as much as I wish it would. There is still judgment about what's best for women. And I would want to put in my plug once again that midwifery is essentially pro-choice in every arena of a woman's life, and we need to stop judging what's appropriate for each woman, the hospital, the home, this kind of midwifery, that kind of midwifery, this OB, that hospital. There's going to be a place for everyone, and our job is to listen to them and figure out what works best for them. Which leads me to a tangent, if I may go right on a tangent, of a couple of stories, if you will, about pro-choice. Pro-choice sometimes can be quite difficult to be supportive of that, and I came upon that very early in my career. There was a woman who had had a home birth in her first birth, and in her second, maybe it wasn't a home birth, it was a hospital birth, home birth. So in her second, her water ruptured. It was in the days when we didn't do GBS culturing. We did temperatures and we'd bring them in for non-stress test, and we supported choice. So when she refused to be intervened with or induced, we supported her choice. But on the third day, she had a fever she didn't tell anyone about. And I learned a lot about how you need to support women through choice, but how difficult that can be. So I was a newer midwife. I asked her please to come in. She came in. The baby was in tachycardic distress. I pleaded with her to let us do intervention. She refused. I called in my senior midwife. I called in the backup doc. All of us begged her to let us intervene. At this point, the baby was in extreme distress, and we went from asking her if we could intervene with antibiotics and or induction to immediate C-section. Her husband begged her. The outcome of that was that she, for her own interior valid reasons, thought everything would be fine. She was going to trust, and because the first birth was fine, and that baby died. And I learned a really hard lesson, that we have to be pro-support of women's choices, but we also need to know when to speak up. And we did that day. We begged her. I say this now because I'm thinking in terms of when I said pro-support of women's choices. That doesn't mean not giving appropriate, sound, valid advice from your heart, from your experience, from your education. And so that afforded me, for the last 20 years, after that experience, or 25 years, that afforded me an experience where I could say directly to people who were making choices that I felt were putting babies in jeopardy, that I had been at a place that I had been there when trusting the body or the process put a baby in jeopardy, and I had been there to witness the death of a baby, and I say it freely to women. I'm not afraid of saying that death word because I witnessed it, and I say to them, I never want to witness that again, and I never want anyone else to witness that. And that was, again, this woman taught me something early in my career about how far you go with pro-choice, you know, for women and their choices. You still have to say what's real, and you can't protect them from that in a way that we tend to want to protect them. Sometimes new midwives don't want to use the death word, or they don't want to scare the person, but I can say with all of my honesty, that was a horrible experience for me and for everyone involved, and the baby didn't have to die. So if it had been a home birth situation, they would have blamed it on home birth. If it was in a hospital birth situation like it was, no one could assign blame to this because we all were there in honesty. So that's important to learn, I think, that while you're supporting people, say what you know is true. Anything else?
Well, just like it's helpful for you to have gone through an experience and to carry it through as something that teaches you constantly and that you share with women, I think it's important for us to hear your story and to carry that on as, you know, just vicariously through you. I can take that story on. Are there any other, you know, joyful or other challenging, difficult stories that you have that you would like to share?
I'm a midwife who tells stories. There's plenty of stories, but I will tell one because I think it forces midwives out of the profession, which is unexpected outcomes force midwives out. If they get named in a lawsuit, whether there's any blame assigned, their spirit gets sometimes hurt by that. And that's another tangent, which is in the field, we don't have enough support for this. If you're named in a lawsuit, you're not allowed to speak about it, so it becomes this secret you carry. When you carry a secret, whether it's valid to carry it or not, it engenders shame. Secrets engender shame, whether or not there's something to be shameful for. So suddenly midwives who were ebullient the day before and happy are now filled with secrets and shame until the case, which can linger for up to 7 years, goes to trial. Often by then, because they've had no support in the field, traditionally, they're demoralized and they leave the field. I've known several midwives who left after a lawsuit, even though they were found blameless later. It just did them in. So I'm hoping that the profession continues to employ strategies to support their midwives, either by administrative policies or, you know, support groups, anything like that. I did have an early experience that really taught me that everything can go well and still there can be a bad outcome, and that's important to carry as a midwife, that there can be things that happen that no one is at fault for. And this was taught to me by a couple 20 years ago. I still get Christmas cards every year. I've watched their 4 subsequent children grow, but their first son died. She was a normal, healthy woman, young woman, first baby, 42 weeks, clear fluid, in natural spontaneous labor, no interventions. We had the best nurse on the unit. We had a good midwife. We had everything we needed. We were in a tertiary care center. And the baby was born in a normal labor curve, even by old standards. And when he came out, there was terminal mech behind his head, and we were in a tertiary care center with great resuscitation. And 2 days later, they discontinued him from life support. And that's another thing that I went to the funeral and was close to the family. And I would say that to midwives, that sometimes everything can be fine, everything can go well. No one's at fault, not the woman, nothing. And you can have a grief or a tragedy or an unexpected outcome. And I would say look for support in yourself, in your family. In the family who's grieving, don't be afraid to grieve with them. Do not be afraid to be as mystified as they are. And you get joy from that as well. I mean, I've watched the rest of the family grow. That was a great tragedy. Great tragedy. I was so sad for a long time, and none of us did anything wrong. It's just a mystery. I have some other quirky stories. I once had a set of twins born on different dates in different states, 10 hours apart.
Wow.
That was interesting. Connecticut people doing home birth, and I was in the hospital, and the doc there was known for accepting breech transfers or unusual home birth transfers, and they were in Connecticut. Labor stopped after the first twin, and they waited and waited and waited, and they knew they would not be well received in the local Connecticut hospital, so they drove 2 hours with one twin in and one twin out.
Wow.
And came to our local hospital here in Massachusetts, and I was the midwife on that day. And as soon as they came to our hospital, labor did actually spontaneously begin again. So there was 10 hours difference in the births, which meant a different date and also a different state.
That is quite a story for that family for a lifetime. Wow.
So I learned a lot. I had someone else who, again, we don't get to do this in our institutions. We don't get to keep early labors when the women say, I just want to be here. We send them home if they're not active. We have to do that in the economic times that we live in. But when we don't have to do that, we see some things. So in this case, there's somebody in first labor. Her husband's a musician. He really needs this gig. They need it financially and he needs it professionally. And it's 9 o'clock at night and she's fully dilated. And the gig starts at 10. And if he stays, it's really difficult. And she said, just go. I know you need it. And she closed her eyes, fully dilated, first time unmedicated, went to sleep. And she just slept on the floor and she slept. And at 3 a.m. when he came back from his gig 6 hours later, she woke up and she had her baby within an hour. And what does that teach you? It teaches you that body-mind integration, body-mind connection is a powerful, powerful thing. And we shouldn't dismiss it. Which is how I live. So I really loved that story.
Yeah.
I loved knowing that there was no harm to the mom, the baby, or the family. It was fine. She just, labor shut down. Consciously, because she knew it.
That's beautiful. I
Cool.
really enjoyed these stories. I can see how the women that you work with in labor and prenatally
Are really
learn
cool.
and learn really cool.
They're really cool.
Virtually just because they're in your presence, but also because they learn from your stories. So thank you.
Speaking of stories, can I tell you one more thing?
Yes,
I don't know
of
if it'll
course.
go in the interview, but new midwives, a little pearl for them. Often they don't ask the questions. They don't ask all the questions maybe that they really know they should ask. And everyone who might hear me speak knows exactly what I mean. And they're afraid of the answers. They're afraid, right? They don't know if they can handle the truth that they might hear, so they don't ask the questions. Even though the woman's fidgeting or she doesn't make eye contact or there's something clearly she wants to say and can't stay, and they're afraid that they don't know how to handle the answers. And I would say, you'll always get exactly what you can handle in this field. Never, never, never be afraid as a new person. You will get exactly what you can handle at the time you can handle it. So be brave and ask the questions, and be brave and say the things that you might want to say. I'm still in touch with a woman who's on a full scholarship at a prestigious college right now as a single mom of 2 boys, but I met her in her first pregnancy as a teen. She had a controlling partner who came to every visit. In one visit where he didn't come, my partner, because we were in that practice, mentioned to this girl that sometimes men can be very controlling, and when the baby comes, they get more controlling, even abusive. And this young woman, as I said, who was a teen then, didn't know what she didn't know why she was being told this, because she didn't see that. But she came back years later to say that that midwife saying something in that way, just saying it, not making her do anything, is what was her survival later when the abuse began. That statement came back. She recognized she was not crazy. She had validity in a reality check given to her by a midwife who knew there was no intervention to be done at the time. And she left her abusive partner and got out of that relationship because of that statement. She's now, as I said, getting her degree, and she's going to be working with women who have been abused. So that's the other thing. If a midwife has a sense of something's going on, or a truth or a reality, you can say it. Just say it. You don't have to blame anyone or confer judgment. You can just say something and trust that it's important that you say it because you felt you should.
Mm.
Could be 5 years before it helps, but it's important to say it.
Well, I hope this helps. I hope
Okay.
this helps you. I know it's helped
Yeah,
me.
okay.
Is there anything else that you would like to
I don't think so.
share?
Gosh,
Those are great. Those are some great stories.
said plenty. I said plenty, all right.
It's been fun
Thank you.
and educational, and we're also grateful to hear your story.
Deb Gowen and
Lisa Weinstein,
signing out.
signing out.